The scripture reading is Matthew 16:4. Matthew 16:4. A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign shall be given to except the sign of the prophet Jonah. And he left them and departed.
Good evening. Glad to have you with us. We last week studied Daniel chapter 5. Part of the art of being a preacher, I suppose, is trying to pack some thoughts into about 30 minutes and tying them up neatly. And I failed miserably at that last Sunday night. We covered too much and I left some things hanging that I'm just going to briefly tie up and then move on. First of all, we were talking about Daniel and Belshazzar and the handwriting on the wall. And at the end, I tried to make some application by asking what the handwriting on the wall is for our country, our church, our world, our civilization. By that, I do not mean that there are going to be signs of the end of time. Nobody's questioned me about this, but I felt like I left it hanging out there. But there aren't going to be signs of the end of time. Christ said that it'll come like a thief in the night. His apostles said it'll come like a thief in the night. It'll be very unexpected. It'll be surprising. But Christ did teach us that you can see certain signs about cultures that are just about to fall, cultures that are degrading. And one of those places is in Matthew chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. The Pharisees and Sadducees came and testing, asking him that he would show them a sign from heaven. He answered and said to them, "When it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it'll be foul weather today, for the sky is red and threatening." You know how we put it, red sky at night, sailors delight, red sky at morning, sailors take warning. Then Jesus told them, "Hypocrites, you know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times." Well, there's something to discerning the signs of the times. In 1 Chronicles 12, verse 32, there were men of Issachar listed who had an understanding of the times. And it's hard not to see that the times that we're in are troubling in many ways. We have two worldviews that are clashing in our culture. It's called the culture wars. Just think what it is at the root of the word culture. It's cult. Now, that doesn't mean that every culture is a cult, but it does mean that there's something that binds people together in a culture. And sometimes those are shared beliefs that are religious. Shintoism bound Japan together before World War II, and their belief that the islands of Japan were creations of the gods, and the emperor was a descendant of the gods, caused them to do what things they did at Pearl Harbor and kamikaze pilots and all of that. There is a culture that binds together a group of people, a civilization. In the East, often it's been Islam since about the 700s. In the West, it's been the broad principles, not New Testament principles, but the broad principles of Christian ethics and so forth. This country used to be a place that stood up for people who had Christian ethics to be able to express them freely. We still are to some degree, but that's being challenged, you know. In the workplace, it's being challenged. The diversity, equity, and inclusion movement, that sounds so wonderful. Those are all great things that Christians should support and name diversity. Yeah, I've been preaching that. I've been preaching against racism for as long as I've been preaching. Equity, yeah, all men are equal. Inclusion, sure, I want people to be included. But remember 2 Corinthians 11 verse 14 says that Satan transforms himself as an angel of light, and therefore it's no surprise if his ministers transform themselves as angels of light. Those things become anti-Christian in some of their applications sometimes. And people in the workplace are forced to choose. Am I going to address this person by that pronoun that they request? Am I going to pretend with this person that that person is what he's pretending to be? And there are a whole lot of choices that have to be made, and a lot of it is direct attack on Christian culture. You can see the signs of the times. Now, with that said, I'm going to bounce sort of in a different direction to one of the manifestations of that culture war. There are some of us who believe in God, some of us who believe in creation as the Bible says it, and there are a lot of people out there that don't. And that's been true as long as I've been alive. In the 1980s, I remember the discussion was, how do you take a biology test? How do you take an earth science test? Well, you answer the questions according to the evolutionary doctrine that they taught you, but you might write on the test, this is the answer you want, but I don't believe it. So we were being forced to imbibe that sort of thing for a long time, and now it's just come to another level. And the particular level that we want to discuss tonight is climate change. What caught my attention to this is a fellow by the name of John Clauser. Saw an article that was written on September 10th of 2023. Actually, I found this article after seeing some headlines about this man. I'll tell you about this man a little bit and his qualifications. This article was written in the Epoch Times by Jan Jekelek and Miani Neguente. I can't pronounce their names, but I want you to know this is stuff I just didn't make up. I have the citations here. And I also realized that the things I'm going to cite to you are biased websites. I don't think there's an unbiased website. I don't know. When I write biased. When I write for the church, I write biased. When I write on any kind of, I write in a biased fashion. I try to present evidence, and I have a bias that Christ is the Son of God, and everything's going to lean toward that. Other people have bias different directions. You have to weigh the evidence and see which one comes out and the winner in the field of logic and truth. Well, this was a biased article, but here's the thing. The man shows all kinds of evidence of not being that biased. He's not a Christian man, I don't think. At least there's no indication of it. He's very scientific in his approach to things. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2022, but he's come under a whole lot of fire since then for challenging the prevailing climate models. His name is John Clauser, or Clauser, however you pronounce it. He's been extremely contributory to the field of quantum mechanics. He holds degrees from Caltech and Columbia University. He served in roles at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and the University of California, Berkeley. And you know that's not exactly a conservative bastion, to put it mildly. In 2010, he was honored with a portion of the Wolf Prize in Physics. Recently, Mr. Clauser joined another Nobel laureate and over 1,600 professionals, 1,600 professionals, in signing what is called the World Climate Declaration, WCD, organized by Climate Intelligence. This declaration asserts that there, quote, is no climate emergency. The climate change science is not conclusive, and that the Earth's history over thousands of years shows a consistently changing climate. In other words, these 1,600 professionals in their fields of scientific study say the climate change stuff that we're hearing in the news all the time simply is not true. And these aren't people who are coming from a Christian background necessarily. I don't know all of their backgrounds, but they're coming from a scientific background. And they're saying there's something missing in the models that are giving us all of the hysteria. Now, Mr. Clauser, to try to sum it up for you, has gotten some of his work from his field in this way. When he was a younger man and sailing, they would have solar panels on the sailboat. He noticed that when the sailboat would pass under some pretty stout clouds, that the solar panel output would always be lowered by about 50%. He wondered why it was always that. He studied it. I don't understand all the reasons for the conclusions that he came to, but he came to a hypothesis that the clouds were reflecting light more than we thought they were, and also helping with the output of carbon dioxide, or CO2, on this Earth. And in other words, he said the clouds more than make up for man's output of CO2 by 100 to 200 times. We say we're putting out too much CO2. We got to turn our cars off. We got to buy a car that stops at a red light and shuts down the engine so you can save the planet. But he says all the CO2 we put out is more than made up for by the clouds. Of course, people dispute that. They're going to. Mr. Clauser observed that the drive to address human-induced climate change is, and these are in the words of the writers who interviewed him, the drive to address human-induced climate change is increasingly shaping political agendas and influencing the strategic direction of entire nations. In his words, he said, The whole world is doing all of this. A lot of the pressure is actually coming from Europe, all of these various world conferences, he said, speculating much of this push might have its roots in Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth from back in the 2000s. He feels has incorporated inaccurate science. He says that Mr. Gore's film claims that humanity is triggering a dire climate crisis that necessitates global action, but here's what Mr. Clouser says about that. Climate change is actually very dishonest disinformation that has been presented by various politicians. Now, he pinpoints a 2013 Physics Today article by Jane Lubcheno and Thomas Carl as pivotal in shaping the narrative. He says, in other words, the narrative. People are out to write a narrative today. They're not always out to give us the facts. They're out to write a narrative the way they want us to behave. And he says this was a pivotal point when they renamed global warming to climate change. Well, they found out it wasn't warming as much as they thought it should, so they renamed it to climate change to preserve the narrative. He says the reason that was given was, well, because it's really more than just warming, he said. The article champions a U.S. Climate Extremes Index, claiming that anthropogenic climate change, or man-made climate change, led to a significant increase in the extreme weather events over the past 3 decades, ending in 2012. Every time you hear of a hurricane, every time you hear of an earthquake, every time you hear of anything that happens, it's because of climate change anymore. And we have more of these disasters than we used to, is the hypothesis. But Mr. Clouser notes that the index left out the frequency of EF3 plus tornadoes. That is EF3 on the scale. If you've seen Twister, that's a pretty bad tornado or higher. It left out the frequency of those, perhaps because, as highlighted by another fellow in his book, those were on a noticeable decline. So all the information the climate scientists gathered to drive their narrative left out that the strongest tornadoes were on a sharp decline in frequency. He said, Mr. Clouser said, this, in my opinion, is a rather egregious breach of honesty by the U.S. government, by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. He said, not only, as I understand it, are these extreme weather events not increasing, but our ability to mitigate them has increased. So they're just not as much of an issue, Mr. Clouser said, adding later, this worry about carbon dioxide, the worry about methane, the worry about global warming is all a total fabrication by shocked journalists and dishonest politicians. That's his conclusion. Now, he says that the resources that are used for that would be better allocated for humanitarian endeavors. He says it's a total waste of money and time and effort. It is strangling industry. Well, there is a field of thought out there that says that the climate change narrative is being driven to change the economy from capitalist to communist, and that's what is the game, is to shut down a whole bunch of industry. I don't know about that, but that is one of the things that you could be challenged to research and possibly believe. Now, I had some notes on this when I decided to preach on this week. I'd been saving some notes and saving some articles for some time. I'll come across things on my phone, have the ability to copy a link and save it in a OneNote file, and I had a whole bunch of links there. I don't have time to get to all of them. But one place that had some interesting things was the Competitive Enterprise Institute. See, they're about competitive enterprise, and they're saying that climate change is affecting them. So they had some agenda, they had some bias, and they want to show where the world has been in the last 50 years on this issue. We hear a lot about global warming. We hear about the increasing temperatures. Even though it's been renamed climate change, that's still the dire emergency, they say. But they post on their website, not just print, not just text, but pictures of newspapers from all over the world, from the 60s, the 70s, that were warning us of something quite different. Do any of you remember that in the 60s and 70s, the climate scientists were saying there was going to be another ice age? We were afraid the pollution was going to cloud the environment so that we'd all freeze. Here are some examples. In the LA Times in 1967, George Getze wrote an article called Dire Famine Forecast by 1975. Here are a couple of quotes from it. It is already too late for the world to avoid a long period of famine, a Stanford University biologist said Thursday. Paul Ehrlich was a population scientist. He was the one that said that we ought to enforce some birth control rules, even involuntarily on people, put birth control in foods that poor people eat because we need to control population because of the climate. He was famous in the 70s. And he's quoted in this article as saying that the time of famines is upon us and will be at its worst and most disastrous by 1975. Well, that came and went, and there were some famines, but not the worldwide stuff they were predicting. He said that the population of the United States is already too big, that birth control may have to be accomplished by making it involuntary and by putting sterilizing agents into staple foods and drinking water, and that the Roman Catholic Church should be pressured into going along with routine measures of population control. Now, that was back in '67 that Mr. Ehrlich said that. And you see what it was? I'm not defending the Roman Catholic Church. But they go a little too far. They're right in being against abortion, but they're wrong in being against birth control. Birth control stops a baby before it's born, before it's conceived. Abortion stops it after there's life there. Well, see, the whole thing about abortion now is not always just about, it's not any time about a woman's right, and it's not any time about a woman's right to choose. It's about controlling people. It's about deceiving people. It's about making people more ungodly. And it's about this kind of thing where they think that they can engineer society. They're not putting stuff in people's food. I'm not alleging that. But I will allege that Planned Parenthood is deceitful, and they deceive young women into having abortions when they don't give them all the evidence. And you don't have to look too far to find evidence for that. Anytime there's a right-to-know law that simply says a 16-year-old has the right to know what's going to go on in the procedure that she is about to undertake, these people fight against it. And they claim to be the right to choose people. It's a bunch of lies. In the New York Times, August 10th, 1969, Robert Reinhold, quoting Paul Ehrlich, population biologist at Stanford University, said, "We must realize that unless we are extremely lucky, everybody will disappear in a cloud of blue steam in 20 years. So in 1969, Paul Ehrlich said, we're going to be disappearing. Everybody will disappear in a cloud of blue steam in 20 years. That'd be 1989. I was married 1 year at the time. I'm still here. April 16th, 1970, Boston Globe, James P. Lodge Jr., scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, said, air pollution may obliterate the sun and cause a new ice age in the first third of the next century. Well, we're just about through the first fourth of that century to which he was referring, and now they're not talking about an ice age at all. They're talking about quite the opposite. Redlands, California, Daily Facts, October 6, 1970, Paul Ehrlich, again, predicts the oceans will be as dead as Lake Erie in less than a decade. I don't even know what that means, but that's what he said. America will be subject to water rationing by 1974 and food rationing by 1980. Victor Cohn of the Washington Post in July 9, 1971, Dr. S.I. Rasool of NASA and Columbia University says that in the next 50 years, the fine dust that man constantly puts into the atmosphere by fossil fuel burning could screen out so much sunlight that the average temperature could drop by 6 degrees. That's what they were saying in 1971. If sustained over several years, 5 to 10 years, he estimated, such a temperature decrease could be sufficient to trigger an ice age. In a letter to the President Nixon, on December 3, 1972, George J. Kukla of Lamont Doherty Geological Observatory and R.K. Matthews, the chairman of the Department of Geological Sciences, for the conference, wrote to the President and said, the main conclusion of the meeting was that a global deterioration of climate by order of magnitude larger than any hitherto experienced by civilized mankind is a very real possibility and indeed may be due very soon. Now, note what they're saying. We've been measuring, first of all, there's a couple of things to note. Note the hypocrisy and the arrogance of these people. We've been measuring temperature, been measuring weather for what? At the most a couple hundred years, scientifically? And the earth, according to creationists, is 6,000 to 10,000 years old. If they accepted a young earth, they would still have to say that the time they've been measuring stuff is only a fraction of the time the earth has been here. And yet they have the arrogance to go off of those predictions of that minuscule amount of time and predict what's going to happen in 20 years, watch it not happen, and keep predicting something else. But then, keep in mind that these people are the ones who believe the earth is 400 billion years old. So their arrogance just increased exponentially to say that we've been keeping temperature for a couple hundred years out of the 400 billion that they say have been here, and to say we can use that to predict. It's quite the proud stance to take. In Time magazine, June 24th, 1974, the science section said, "Telltale signs are everywhere, from the unexpected persistence and thickness of pack ice in the waters around Iceland to the southward migration of a warmth-loving creature like the armadillo from the Midwest. Since the 1940s, the mean global temperature has dropped about 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit." In 1974, they said since the 40s, it's dropped 2.7 degrees. That was Time magazine. There are many more articles. There are many more threats that were put forth. We had threats about the ozone layer. You couldn't use spray deodorant anymore. We had threats about acid rain. But by 1988, things had shifted. I remember 1988. It was the year I was married. Married May 7th, spent the next 6 weeks in Europe on a chorus tour with my new wife, 44 other people on the bus during our honeymoon. It was a wonderful time. We then came back to work at the Pennsboro Church in June and found out we'd already been in a drought season here for 6 weeks. It was very hot. I was worried, drought like this. The alarmists got to me. Well, here's an article from 1989 referring to the drought of 1988. It says, it's by Edward Stiles of the Gannett News Service in the Lansing State Journal, Lansing, Michigan. It says, "If you liked last summer's record temperatures, you're going to love the 1990s, says James Hansen, the NASA scientist who, during congressional hearings on the Midwestern drought, linked greenhouse warming to the heat wave. If we do nothing to cut down on pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, temperatures in 2050 will be 6 to 7 degrees higher than they are today. Washington, D.C., for instance, would go from its current 35 days a year over 90 degrees to 85 days a year, and the level of the ocean will rise anywhere from 1 to 6 feet. Somehow, in 1988, everything went from being, oh, we're going to have an ice age, to, uh-oh, we're going to rise by 6 to 7 degrees. Somehow. And note that the same fossil fuels that were being burned that were going to cause an ice age are now going to cause us global warming that's going to burn us all to death. 1989, the AP, Associated Press, about the United Nations, says rising seas could obliterate nations. A senior UN environmental official says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if the global warming trend is not reversed by the year 2000. Coastal flooding and crop failures could create an exodus of eco-refugees, threatening political chaos, said Noel Brown, director of the New York office of the UN Environment Program, or UNEP. He said governments have a 10-year window of opportunity to solve the greenhouse effect before it goes beyond human control. Well, we're 34 years beyond that article now. We missed the 10-year window, so why even try? I'd be sarcastic because you meet absurdity sometimes with some absurdity. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 18, if you would. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 20. God says, "But the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name, which I've not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die." Now, I'm not suggesting that anybody be killed for their predictions here. Don't think that. This is Old Covenant law that does not apply to us. But there is a principle here from which we can learn. Verse 21, "And if you say in your heart, how shall we know the word which the Lord has not spoken?" Well, how do we know who the false prophet is? This is pretty serious. How do we know? "When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the thing does not happen or come to pass, that is the thing which the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You shall not be afraid of him." Just like the people who've been predicting, the religious people who've been predicting the coming of the Lord every so often, don't be afraid of them. It came, it went, it didn't happen. Don't be afraid of the climate scientists. They've been predicting falsehoods for decades now. Don't be afraid of them, and know that they're false prophets. And know that they're religious. They worship the earth, and they worship the created thing, the creature, rather than the creator, Romans chapter 1. And then this becomes political. Here's an article by Adam Shaw in Fox News. I know Fox News is biased. I get that. Everything's biased one way or the other. From July 12, 2019, where he has interviewed Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's chief of staff. And that chief of staff recently admitted, he said, that the Green New Deal was not conceived as an effort to deal with climate change, but instead a, quote, how do you change the entire economy thing. A remark likely to fuel Republican claims that the deal is nothing more than a thinly veiled socialist takeover of the U.S. economy. So he went on to try to balance his claim and actually work against that claim, but that's what the lady said. The interesting thing about the Green New Deal is it wasn't originally a climate thing at all. Do you guys really think of it as a climate thing? Because we really think of it as a how do you change the entire economy thing. That's what her chief of staff said. Then that's, the last few years, we've seen a whole bunch of regulations come down from natural gas water heaters, natural gas heaters, air conditioner stoves. They're going to drive prices up and drive people to poor, and it's all based on lies. It's all based on worshiping the creature rather than the creator. It's based on paganism rather than Christianity. The world meets Christianity full force in this battle. Genesis 8:22. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, day and night shall not cease from the earth. We're going to have the seasons, we're going to have the climate, as long as the earth exists, God promised after the flood. Yeah, I believe God created the earth. I believe that's where the evidence points. I believe there was a global flood. That's where the evidence overwhelmingly points. I believe that the world is going to stand just as long as God wants it to stand. Hebrews chapter 1 says that Christ is upholding all things by the word of his power. It's not the gasoline in your engine that's going to destroy the world. It's the word of Christ that's going to destroy the world. He's going to come back, and that's going to be it for everybody. And it's going to be a global warming event, but it's going to be a sudden fire of destruction upon the wicked and the ungodly, while the righteous are taken to be with God in heaven. There's no way that all of us together, with all of our efforts, our brightest people, our most malicious minds, could possibly ever destroy the earth. Only God will do that when he's ready. The thing we need to do is to be ready for that. The day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with a fervent heat. The earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. Therefore, since all these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be dissolved and the elements will melt with fervent heat. 2 Peter 3:10 through 12. Man, I'm looking forward to that day. The foolishness of this world, the sin of this world, the pride of this world just causes more human suffering. For innocent children, for people who are brought up with these lies and then come to believe them. And the world needs salvation. The world needs the truth. If you abide in my word, you're my disciples indeed, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. John 8:31 and 32. Have you ever thought about how broadly those words apply? The truth could set us free from all this climate hypocrisy. The truth could set us free from political people that oppress other people. We wouldn't be worshiping Kim Jong-un in North Korea, we'd be worshiping God, and you'd have more freedom. The truth will set people free. Well, we can't change the world except for one individual at a time. And individuals need to believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, repent of their sins, confess him, be baptized for the remission of their sins, and live for him. Study his word, the evidence that points to it for what is true. Live faithfully to him. If we could help you tonight, would you please come as we stand and sing?